Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell. Today we're going to talk about food webs and food chains. Here are the questions. Go ahead and write them down. See if you can find the answers in the video. Well, here's where we start talking about food webs, and we'll kind of lead up to that. You can see we have a food chain and a food web here, but we'll talk about all the details. Each organism in an ecosystem fills the energy role of either a producer, a consumer, or a composer. So the producers, and let's see if I can get some color to that. The producers are organisms that make their own food. And the producers are going to be down here on the bottom of the food chains and food webs. All these plants, trees, bushes can have photosynthesis, which makes their own food. So by definition, all of those organisms are going to be producers. And pretty much all of them are going to get their energy from sunlight. Sunlight comes in and the plant uses the sunlight along with water and glucose to make photosynthesis, or that's part of the equation anyway. So most producers get their energy to produce food from the sun, and that energy will end up climbing up the web to the consumers. Consumer, as you can guess, cannot make their own food. It has to feed upon other organisms, whether they're plants or whether they're animals. We're a consumer. We cannot make our own food. Wouldn't it be strange if we could? But anyway, we cannot make our own food, so we are a consumer. And anything that eats these plants are going to be consumers also, and eats these animals are also going to be consumers as well. And there are some distinctions with consumers. Um, well, I don't know if you can see them here, but I have herbivore right there. Wow, that's not very good, is it? But herbivore, Herbivore, that is a consumer that just eats plants. A carnivore is a consumer that just eats meat. An omnivore is a consumer that can eat plants or animals or the meat. And those are kind of the main three categorizations of consumers. Now there's also a scavenger. A scavenger is, well, kind of on a different plane. A scavenger feeds, it's a carnivore, but it feeds off of dead animals. A buzzard is a scavenger. You know, you might could say that's similar to all other decomposers. I have the word decomposer right here. A decomposer is the third one besides producer, consumer. It's the third kind of organism that fills these roles. A decomposer breaks down animal waste and dead organisms. I don't know if you can see underneath my picture here, there happens to be a picture of a mushroom. Mushroom is a decomposer. Um, I think I mentioned that buzzards probably would be kind of filling into that category. Bacteria would fill into that category. It seems kind of gross to feed upon dead animals or to feed upon animal waste. But decomposers are an important part of keeping the cycle going. And these decomposers are fed upon by other animals. And fed upon so that kind of helps keep the cycle going. Now, let's talk about the energy that is transferred. Energy is transferred even as you're going up the food webs here. You have energy that's transferred from organism to organism. You get the original energy from the sun. Get the original energies from the sun, and that's a pitiful little sun there. And let me try to color it in and make it a little bit better. And that's not working very well at all. So I'll draw a few lines. But the original energy comes from the sun, and the plants use that to make photosynthesis. So whenever, say, a moth eats part of a plant or an ant eats part of the plant, they get some of that energy. Whenever a mouse or a spider or whatever this happens to be behind food web here eats that, it also gets some of that original energy from the sun. And you can see that pretty clearly on the food chains and the food webs. Now, the difference between a food chain and food web is kind of subtle. A food chain is kind of like this branch right here, where you have a direct line from the producer, which is eaten by a first level consumer, which is eaten by, I guess you'd say, a second level consumer. It's a direct line. It's obvious which is first, which is second, and so on. So you could say this is kind of like a food chain. But this food web here, you can see this mouse is a good example here in the middle. This mouse could be an animal which would eat the plants and be what you might call a first level consumer. Or in this case, it ate the moth, which ate the plants. So in the real world, you have more of a food web than you have a food chain because, I mean, even we as humans, the top of the food chain or food web, that we can eat plants or we can eat all these animals which have eaten the plants as well. So food webs are kind of more a real life actuality of what's actually going on. Okay, I have over on this next part another thing that we need to talk about. It's an energy pyramid. Energy pyramid. And you can see down here an energy pyramid. It's a food web that shows energy transferred. And the energy is going to be in kilocalories or calories. And you've heard calories many, many times whenever you've heard about food. But it's actually produced in kilocalories or calories. This food web shows the energy transferred, and notice that you only have about 10% of the energy that is actually transferred up the food chain, up the food pyramid. So we have 1,000 calories that these plants take from the sun, and they use most of that before they are even eaten by, say, the grasshoppers. Grasshoppers only get about 1/10 of that original amount. Then look up here, we have the moles, I suppose that is, which only get about 1/10 of the 100, 110 and 100. And then you have the top of this pyramid, which is the owl, which gets only 1 kilocalorie of all the 1,000 that was consumed. The higher up you go up food webs and food chains, the less energy that is gotten. So it kind of makes sense that these things on top of the food chain will eat more to get more of that energy. So they have to, I guess, kind of work harder. And what that does, it kind of ensures fewer species at the top of the pyramid. The World Food Web has exchange of water, carbon, and oxygen. Here you have water that's in these grasshopper bodies, which is eaten by the moles, which is eaten by the owl. You actually have carbon, which is in bodies as well, and oxygen, which ends up being transferred also. Now, what will also often happen is that oxygen will end up being breathed, exhaled by the plants. Carbon dioxide will be exhaled by the animals, and you got some of the release of that as that happens. Another thing we need to talk about is nitrogen. Just like you have an exchange of water, carbon dioxide, carbon, and oxygen, you have an exchange of nitrogen. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it because you probably remember the water cycle and oxygen cycle and so on from last year. But species also exchange nitrogen. Now, most organisms cannot use nitrogen in its natural state. On the periodic table, it's named N or labeled as N. It has to be combined with something. Whenever nitrogen is combined with something, that's when animals can use it. And the process of combining nitrogen with other things is called nitrogen fixation. Fixation. Now, you have to have bacteria in beans and peas and peanuts and so on that fix the nitrogen, that break down the nitrogen to where it can be used by the animals and by the plants. Now, consumers eat these foods, and nitrogen ends up being stored in all these foods, all these organisms that are on the food chain. And they let the nitrogen go in their waste and whenever they decompose. And that process is called the nitrogen cycle. Don't forget to go back and find any questions that you haven't gotten an answer to yet. And I hope you've learned a little bit about the food web.